Vladimir Putin is starting to show signs of weakness. At an emergency meeting, the Russian leader admitted to fuel shortages as Ukraine ups strikes on energy resources. But he denied any real impact. As the nation begins to burn through its reserves, though, you have to wonder if this could eventually halt his military campaign. And if he has no oil to sell abroad, that would make it tricky to fund this war.
We must minimize the consequences of terrorist attacks on our peaceful civilian facilities and infrastructure. At the same time, you are well aware that problems remain for both motorists and businesses. Unfortunately, there are still queues at gas stations. The required grade of gasoline is not always available. And, of course, we understand the difficulties facing farmers during the summer period.
And the fuel crisis is spreading. There's also an election coming up, and Putin sounded worried at a party congress about unity.
Russia is facing harsh and, without any exaggeration, unprecedented pressure from Western elites. They cannot defeat us on the battlefield. They are trying to destabilize the political situation and sow internal discord. But that is not working either. Russia has always been strong and victorious thanks to national unity. It is precisely this unity that haunts some of those who wish us ill. As I have already noted, they would like to undermine our national unity, to call it into question. They have never succeeded, and they will not succeed now.
I'm now joined by Ivana Stradner from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. She specializes in Russian security strategy. So how do you read Putin admitting to this fuel crisis?
So he had to admit something. He didn't say that this is a grave concern, but he definitely had to address because domestically, Russia is struggling. And imagine if Russian center of gravity is energy, and domestically there are problems with fuel, so Putin is really in trouble. But I would also say that it's too early to predict whether Putin can be overthrown and whether this can bring thousands and thousands of people on the streets of Moscow or St. Petersburg. However, we need to put this in the context of Russia also completely changing the information space and shutting it down over the course of the past few months, because Putin understands that there are more and more people inside Russia who are very dissatisfied with the economy. Some of them are not angry that Putin is waging this awful aggressive war against Ukraine, but they're upset because Putin is losing the war. And I think this also brings a very important point to the West, that Putin just announced that he is ready to negotiate with the West. But he's not going to negotiate from the position of strength. He's going to negotiate from the position of despair. And now is the time to put more pressure on the Kremlin.
So is that what we're seeing here, a rare sign of weakness?
I would say so, because Russia is definitely not performing well on the battlefield, and Putin is increasingly becoming dissatisfied with that. Domestically, the Russians are very dissatisfied with the economy, and the war has been going on for years and not just for 72 days, as many people inside Russia had been hoping for. And finally, we are also talking about the reimposition of sanctions coming from the West. So Putin is really not in a good place. But this is also really an opportunity for the West, as Putin now wants to go back to the negotiation table. The West should not fear all his threats, because now is the time to impose more sanctions and to deliver all the weapons that Ukraine needs to put Russia on the defensive. And finally, we already saw over the course of the past few weeks, even more intense drone, bringing basically drone war to Russia. And that tells you all you need to know, that Ukraine is not, doesn't want to lose this war. As a matter of fact, they are in a very strong position to make sure that Putin will have to end this war.
Well, Ivana, I find it interesting on the same day that Putin acknowledges fuel shortages after these Ukrainian drone strikes, he says Russia is facing unprecedented pressure by Western elites. Is his hope that Russians will rally behind the banner in times of crisis, say?
Look, Putin has a background in KGB, and one of his most powerful weapons, indeed, has been psychological pressure on his own population. And he actually arose to power by portraying Russia as a victim. He has been accusing the West for a very long time of plotting a color revolution inside Russia, and always portraying, the Kremlin as a victim coming, from the West. So I'm absolutely not surprised by his statements from the political party because he has been really trying, to rally people around those nationalistic narratives. He completely destroyed pro-Western opposition, strengthened the far-right groups, and then positioned himself as some sort of like a pillar of stability, as he likes to call himself. But I think more and more people inside Russia are growing dissatisfied with him. The problem is that his authoritarian rule doesn't allow free and fair elections in Russia, and here security forces are ready to whatever it's necessary to protect his regime. So let's see, what the coming months are bringing. But what I would like to see is more sanctions on Russia, especially when it comes to energy sector, to basically even more destabilize his pillar of stability, and more importantly, to provide Ukraine with the weapons that Ukraine needs to put Russia on the defensive, because Putin is willing to negotiate, but don't forget, he is this time negotiating not from the position of strength, but for the position of despair. And finally, even when we bring him to a negotiation table, we should not be living in a fairy tale that he wants to just end this war. Mm-hmm. He would love to pause and then to reposition and to continue. That's why powerful sanctions are absolutely necessary as soon as possible.
Well, you mentioned sanctions, but at the same time, he's considering an export ban for diesel, for example. And you were saying to us how central energy is to Russia and the economy. Oil and gas have been the main source of revenue for Putin's war machine. How's he going to fund the war?
Indeed, that's precisely why he's very dissatisfied and he's very concerned. And Ukraine absolutely knows that the best way to stop Putin war machinery is to target the war machine where he's funding the war, as you mentioned, exactly the energy. And not only that this is going to be very important, for stopping his war machine, but also psychologically to show that the Kremlin is not 6 foot tall, as many people in the West sometimes think, because Putin is really not in a good place. And at least, over the course of the past few years, he has been using constantly nuclear threats, escalation threats, et cetera, And I think Washington and our allies, whether they're sitting in Berlin, in Brussels, or London, are not falling for those threats anymore, which is really a good sign.
Could restrictions on fuel exports, if I can bring it back to that again, even threaten Russia's economic partnerships with countries like China or India?
Oh, absolutely. Look, nobody likes a loser. And China and Russia are frenemies. They have mutual interests, but they also have a mutual enemy, which is the United States and the West writ large. So that was the source of their cooperation. But China is absolutely not willing to step up and to save Putin. But also Putin, we already saw that couldn't help, his allies, whether they're sitting in Syria, in Venezuela. So he is also not a reliable partner. And as I mentioned, really nobody likes a loser, and politics is all about power and transaction when it comes to the Kremlin and its allies. So we should not fear all of those things when it comes to energy sector, because neither China or India will help.
And what makes you so optimistic that the time is right now that Ukraine has momentum on its side. I mean, could the latest onslaught by Ukraine, striking deeper into Russia, be a flash in the pan?
So, as you mentioned, yes, Ukraine is right now striking deep into Russia, which means that this war has been brought also to Russia. And on the other hand, Putin is struggling economically, but also domestically, he is totally paranoid. He's losing his allies. So he is really not in a good state of negotiation. As I mentioned, he's not this time arriving to negotiation table with power and with ability, to impose certain conditions. Now is the time for the EU, for London and for Washington to impose our demands and not to basically seek any concessions. We don't have to.
Security analyst Ivana Stradner, thank you very much for the analysis. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
And what do you think? Could this be the beginning of the end of the war? Let us know. I'm Ben Fajzullin.